there has been some criticism that the West is not doing enough. Where do you come down on that issue?
I think the criticism on the fact that the West hasn't done enough are a bit harsh, personally, because the set of sanctions that have been adopted by the EU, the UK, and the US, and other Western countries over the last few days are unprecedented, both in their scope and in the sectors that are targeted. The idea set up by Western nation is to completely isolate the Russian financial systems and banking system from the rest of the world. And to give you a specific example, for instance, the Central Bank of Russia had gathered significant assets, both currencies and gold, in an attempt to use them should sanctions be imposed on the Russian economy. And the EU and the US and the UK have targeted specifically the Central Bank of Russia to ensure that these assets are not used or not usable outside of the borders of Russia.
Yeah, and those final measures appear to be the most tough, punitive ones announced yet. But I think the main criticism really is that Vladimir Putin and his most inner circle, these hardline defense officials, are very insular. They don't travel abroad. They don't have assets abroad. So that many of these sanctions, even if they are unprecedented, that they might not penetrate that very inner circle.
You're probably right. The Russian oligarchs and the inner circle have also prepared for these sanctions, and a lot of the assets have been repatriated back to Russia or are held through very complex financing structure, which make them quite impossible to seize. But the sanctions that are targeting Russia are not only targeting the oligarchs and the inner circle, they're also targeting the Russian economy. And we're already seeing some signs that the Russian economy is suffering from these sanctions. And ultimately, this means that the Russian people will probably suffer from these sanctions. Just last night, for instance, MasterCard and Visa announced that they would stop providing services within Russia, or at least they would stop providing services to users, foreign users in Russia, or to Russians for their use of their cards outside of the borders of Russia. I think ultimately the sanctions are also targeting the Russian economy and targeting the Russian people by way of consequence. And I think what's the one of the aims of the Western nations is to try to get some sense of resentment and anger from the Russian people that may also put pressure on the government of Vladimir Putin.
Can you talk to us a little bit more about that? So let's ignore the Kremlin for the moment. These sanctions, as we've been saying, they are unprecedented, but we're seeing the effects already on the Russian economy. Tell us what it means for an ordinary Russian person day to day. What's the impact so far?
We've already seen, and there's been quite a lot of image on the news channels. We're seeing Russians having issues being able to withdraw cash. There's been some limitation imposed also on the ability to withdraw foreign currencies or to use foreign currencies above a certain amount in Russia. We also seeing the first signs of recession, and we're also seeing like an increase in prices, which is also unprecedented. The Russian ruble has devaluated by more than 30%. Over the last week, which ultimately means that consumption goods are going to increase in price, and it's going to be extremely difficult for Russians to continue living the way the life they used to live before these sanctions were imposed.
Also wondering in terms of how these sanctions are enforced globally. We heard from the UK earlier today saying that China needs to step up. We've seen both China and India abstain from condemning Russia's invasion. If they don't endorse sort of this international Western approach to punishing Russia, will these sanctions have as big of an effect as the Western leaders hope?
That's I think the big unknown, and I think the position of China more specifically has been something that Western observers are having a hard time assessing the impact on Western that any support from China may have on Western sanctions. China has had a bit of an ambiguous position with respect to Russia. They haven't condemned Russia the same way Western countries have, but at the same time, it's quite unclear whether the Chinese economy and the Chinese banks will support Russia. China and Russia have developed very strong ties over the last few years. It's been part of the plan of Vladimir Putin, and notably with respect to SWIFT, Russia developed its own system similar to SWIFT, and there's very few international banks which are subscribing to these services, and the few banks are mostly Chinese. So we can see some hints that there is some ties that are trying to be developed between the two countries. But at the same time, the Russian economy is highly dependent on the Western market, and there's some uncertainty as to whether China, both from a finance standpoint, but also in terms of purchasing oil and gas, which is critical to the Russian economy, whether that would be sufficient to alleviate or to moderate the impact of the sanctions on the Russian economy.
Yeah, and even before they get to targeting these sort of Russian energy exports, we heard from Vladimir Putin saying that sanctions on the Russian economy were, quote, akin to an act of war. You're a specialist in the field. Have you ever seen the Russian president so defiant towards these sort of Western sanctions before?
No, the president of Russia hasn't been as defiant as he was yesterday with respect to Western sanctions. As you noted, Russian sanctions have been imposed against Russia for the last 8 years following the annexion of Crimea, but the Western sanctions have been quite dim in terms of their scope, especially compared to these. So I'm not surprised that Vladimir Putin has used such elements of language. But that being said, I think it's purely rhetorical, at least. And even though it's interesting to note that changed in perceptions of sanctions, because it also tells us how this tool is conceived as a tool of economic warfare, and it's the only answer that Western countries could realistically provide following the event in Ukraine. And I think Vladimir Putin is just highlighting also the fact that Western countries have decided not to send troops and not to send the military in Ukraine to assist the Ukrainian people, but instead have chosen this tool, which he chose to qualify as a weapon or as an act of war. But I think it goes within the rhetorics of Vladimir Putin and the one that he's been using us over the last 10 days.
All right, Olivier, thank you very much for your time and your analysis. Olivier Dorgans, counsel within Hughes Hubbard's Sanctions.